My name is Michelle Herzog. I'm the History Social Science Consultant for the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and I am so very excited to welcome you to this very special webcast to introduce you to the College, Career, and Civic Life C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards. You know, we are all very familiar with the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts and Mathematics, and now the Next Generation Science Standards. What those documents are doing to change the face of education for English Language Arts, Math, and Science, this new C3 framework is going to change the face of education for social studies in very much the same ways. But before we go any further, let me explain that you, our live viewers, will have an opportunity to ask some questions at the end of the show by typing them into the chat box on the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to respond to them at the end of our broadcast. So keep that in mind as we go through. Let me now begin by explaining that the C3 framework is really designed to serve two audiences: for states to use to upgrade their state social studies standards, and for practitioners at the local school district level in schools, teachers, curriculum writers. They can use this document to strengthen their social studies programs. And the objectives of the framework are simple. One, to enhance the rigor of the social studies disciplines, an important piece. Second, to build critical thinking, problem solving, and participatory schools to become engaged citizens. And finally, to help align academic programs to the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts in literacy and history social studies, a lot of the work that we're doing in schools. So it brings us to the ultimate goal, which is simple: for students to study civics, economics, geography, and history to become active and engaged citizens in the 21st century. Our distinguished guests on today's broadcast are going to provide some background information for you on how and why the document was created, why it represents a real watershed moment for the social studies, and how it connects to the Common Core State Standards. We're going to talk too about the next steps in implementing it in your classroom and across the nation. A lot to cover. But first, let me allow me to introduce you to our first guest, Susan Griffin, the Executive Director of the National Council for the Social Studies. NCSS is the leading national organization that supports and promotes social studies education across the nation. Susan has been a key leader in this work for over 3 years, and now that the C3 framework is complete and in the hands of NCSS, she's going to continue to play a very important role in how the document is implemented across the nation. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here. This is a special time for social studies.
It is, so thank you for coming all the way out to be with us. This really has been a very collaborative effort from the very beginning, bringing together the leaders and organizations of the many social studies disciplines in one place to create a document to strengthen social studies, while at the same time maintaining the integrity of civics, history, economics, and geography, and the behavioral sciences. Truly a very daunting task. Can you set the stage for us for a little bit? Explain how the various disciplines came together over 3 years ago to begin this work.
I'd be delighted to talk about it because it's remarkable. In January of 2010, the context is that the Common Core ELA and mathematics are just being released. Everyone knows that the science, Next Generation Science Framework, is in the pipeline and well-funded. And we're all thinking to ourselves, in our community, where's social studies? So National Council for the Social Studies and the Civic Mission of Schools invited 15 organizations in civics, economics, geography, and history to sit at the same table, remarkable in itself, and talk about what our next steps might be to address that social studies is really not part of this move to Common Core. So we have kind of a remarkable list of organizations that came together for this. the Council for Economic Education, Geographic Education, all of those organizations decided that this was the time to cooperate and move forward together. They created, after one day together, and I want to say that National Council for the Social Studies spent 50 years before they agreed on a definition of social studies, but this group did it in half a day.
Wow.
And the definition is the social studies is an interdisciplinary exploration of the social sciences and humanities, including civics, history, economics, and geography, in order to develop responsible, informed, and engaged citizen to foster civic, global, historical, geographic, and economic literacy. So it acknowledges how important each of those disciplines are. Mm-hmm. It maintains the importance of each of the disciplines on their own, but also says that there is important things to be gained for students if social studies is taught in an interdisciplinary way. So maintaining the integrity of the disciplines, but also acknowledging that we must come together in order to make it really thoughtful. And then to say that the Partnership for 21st Century Schools has identified literacies that are very much social studies, civic, economic, geographical literacy, and that was included in the definition as well. So we're very proud, not only that it happened, but that it's articulate.
Yeah, that was a big moment. I mean, I can't think of a time where everyone, the whole community came together in such an intentional way. That was huge.
Yeah.
And couldn't produce a document like this unless that had happened.
Well, it did, and they agreed to go forward.
Yeah, well, that's great. And bringing them together with different mindsets is really very challenging, but important to really make the work truly collaborative. Great accomplishment.
I think people realized that this was the time.
Yeah, excellent, great. So let me introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Kathy Swan, who is Associate Professor of Social Studies Education at the University of Kentucky and acted as the project director and lead writer of the C3 framework. Kathy, I know we're Skyping you in. We're so glad you can join us today. Can you share some information with us about how the framework was developed, who was involved, how it was developed, and really what makes this approach to social studies so profound?
I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me, Michelle and Susan. It is a big time for social studies, and we couldn't be happier. So as Susan explained, collaboration was really the key to the success of the C3 project. When this work began, it faced many challenges, including the widely held belief that a common set of anything in social studies was virtually impossible. If the past is any kind of predictor, agreement among a diverse group of social studies educators seemed at best unlikely and at worst disastrous. But on the other hand, in order for this document to be ultimately successful, we really needed that kind of buy-in from a very diverse set of researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. So what I'm going to try and do is as add on to what Susan painted as the beginnings of the project and how it developed over the course of 3 years. So as Susan was saying, you know, at the time that the Common Core came out, I think there was a bit of a tremor that went through the social studies world, and it certainly rocked the professional organizations that Susan was working with, but it was also rocking, in a way, the state education agencies, particularly the social studies consultants in those agencies, wondering if social studies was going to be left behind, or if the Common Core was going to become the de facto standards for history and social science. And so I had the opportunity and have been working with a group of state education agencies in as a collaborative inside CCSSO called the Social Studies Assessment, Curriculum, and Instruction Collaborative. These 23 states, along with Los Angeles County, Office of Education, and the University of Delaware, were having similar conversations that Susan was having, which was, what are we going to do about social studies? Is there going to be a big organization that steps up and kind of champions the work? And we waited, and it didn't look like that was going to happen. And so ultimately, what SASE and the task force decided to do is to work together to build a document that would frame social studies for this next generation. So as Susan said, there were 15 professional organizations that at this point began working with SASE under the SASE umbrella, and we called them the task force. The Task Force for Social Studies State Standards. And these states and these professional organizations worked together over about 12 months time. And really tried to hash out, is a common set of anything possible? And if it is possible, on what foundation will it stand? Are there certain agreements from the very beginning that would direct a group of writers to develop what would become the framework? And in fact, we didn't do it in a day. It took about a year of just really kind of methodically going through the history of social studies, how it had been traditionally characterized, and thinking about the way it should be characterized, drawing on documents that were really strong in the past and documents that we hope to create in the future. And so we ended up building 6 foundational ideas together. And then the first and foremost was that social studies has something significant to contribute to a student's college and career readiness. That was part of the conversation at the time, and we felt that social studies plays an important role in students' academic and career development. In addition to that, though, we planted a flag around civic life. Public schools were founded on a civic mission, and we felt strongly that that mission had been lost in the college career conversation, and that social studies plays an important role in developing our youngest citizens to be engaged civically and actively thinking about their future and current democratic role. In addition to that, as Susan said, we had a lot of conversations about what we call the disciplinary integrity of the social studies. And at the time, there was kind of a mantra around standards: fewer, higher, clearer. And so we definitely wanted to follow in the footsteps of the Common Core and really delineate what are those key important disciplines that are taught K-12 that could form the foundation of the social studies going forward. And we settled on civics, economics, geography, and history. But it's really important to know that we worked with the social and behavioral sciences, the national organizations, and we're pleased that there are appendices in the document that really recognize the important role that those disciplines play as well. Then we began to think about, well, how do these disciplines connect to one another? What are the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary kind of connecting glue that will help propel social studies forward? And inquiry, we landed on inquiry, and that kind of unequivocally became the glue that held the document together, and as well as the disciplines. Another major agreement that we struck was around what I like to call molecular content. It hasn't picked up any steam with others, but I'm going to keep saying it until I hear it reverberate in the social studies community. So I think of molecular content as the dates, the names, the places within the academic disciplines of social studies. And I think that as a group, we agreed that those are important building blocks to a robust and complete understanding of the world. But that this particular document needed to sit at a different perch. And so instead, we really decided to focus the document on the concepts and tools of the disciplines and the deep and enduring understandings that kind of sit at a perch above that molecular content, but not to dismiss that content. We believe strongly that a college and career-ready student needs to have that curricular content in order to fully understand civics, economics, geography, and history, but that needed to be done at a local, at a state or a local level. And then lastly, with the widespread adoption of the Common Core that we've talked about so far, we knew that we needed to speak explicitly and directly about our shared responsibility for literacy education. And so you can see that threaded meaningfully throughout the document. So in the end, and as a result of those year-long conversations, not quite Thunderdome, but there were some frank civil discourse over the course of the year, we came up with these foundations that, in a sense, became the design specs or the design specifications for the C3 framework that were handed to the team of 17 writers that represented the disciplines. So we had historians, economists, geographers, alongside people like me who are social studies educators, teacher educators, to try and build a document around these core ideas. And so we think we did that. And we talk about the three pillars of the document being the inquiry arc, disciplinary literacy, and civic life. And I won't talk about those. I'll leave those for my good colleagues, S.G. Grant and John Lee, to further elaborate. Yeah. But I'll leave on this note, and that is that there were no smoke-filled rooms with curtains drawn, although I think there were times we wish there were. It was really a marketplace of ideas within a pretty big community. So the writing team worked iteratively with the state folks, with the task force and teachers to refine the C3 framework over about an 18-month period. And as we work towards kind of the ending stages, we really widened the tent to include all sorts of stakeholders in social studies education, those within the social studies community and those outside of the social studies community, but still having a really important voice in kind of the whole child, K-12. So ultimately, in the end, we got extremely strong feedback in the for the document this past spring, and spent the summer refining it and ultimately publishing it successfully on September 17th, just a few weeks ago, appropriately Constitution Day, a feat no one believed that was really possible. And you probably see us also in a bit of disbelief, because the 3+ years were a challenge, but a good challenge, and I think an important marker to set the next 100 years of social studies as a really strong time.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Kathy, for sure. I don't think we've ever seen an effort that was this inclusive and intentional about involving such a diverse group. I think that's what really makes this work so profound, create a new paradigm for social studies education. It was a big challenge, daunting task, but very, very successful to move things and help skills development of students. So Susan, I want to ask for your comments on the process. You've been involved in it for a while, but before I do, I want to remind our viewers, if you have any questions you have coming up in your minds, be sure to start submitting some of that in the chat box there. So Susan, you worked with this, you worked right alongside Kathy, helped leading this effort for 3 years. What were the big takeaways from you on a personal and professional level?
The takeaways really are that if you keep refocusing these different perspectives on the ultimate goal, a goal that we shared, that you can get them to continue to stay in the same room and talk about the important goal that we had. And that is to make sure that K-12 social studies would be robust and to offer exactly what you've described, and that is preparation for college, career, and civic life. Yeah. And one of the things that helped, I think, is that Kathy was smart and funny. And so when things were getting pretty bleak, we had a good laugh. We built a big tent, and we talked long and hard.
Yeah. So I know everybody's getting anxious to see it if they haven't looked at it already, for sure. Okay, I want to introduce you to another one of our C3 rock stars. This is Dr. S.G. Grant. He is professor and dean of the Graduate School of Education at Binghamton University. Dr. Grant worked closely with the team as the architect for the conceptual design of the document. SG, we just heard Kathy talk about the inquiry arc and the 4 dimensions. Can you drill down a little bit for us to explain what these concepts and approaches really mean to the social studies teacher in the field?
I'd be happy to, Michelle. Good evening to you and to Susan. I'm thrilled to be with you all tonight. I actually want to begin with a quote by Jerome Bruner from his book, The Process of Education. He said, "We begin with a hypothesis that any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development." Now, we didn't include that quote in the framework. We probably should have, because the spirit of it really infuses the entire document. It's a big challenge to think that we could teach any idea to any child, but in fact, that's what we're all about. And I think that in lots of ways, the inquiry arc kind of encapsulates what Bruner was talking about. It's a set of interlocking, mutually supportive ideas that really kind of highlight the intersection of teachers, learners, and ideas. And I want to come back to that point a little bit later. But let me talk a little bit more specifically about the actual dimensions of the inquiry arc. Those 4 dimensions are 1, developing questions and planning inquiries; 2, applying disciplinary concepts and tools; 3, evaluating sources and using evidence; and 4, communicating conclusions and taking informed action. You know, in lots of ways, social studies at its heart is really about understanding why people do the things they do. Some of those things are noble and ambitious and brave, and some of those things are cowardly and silly and naive. But they all make up the fabric of social life. And so, in some ways, everything that people do and say and think is fair game for social studies. That, of course, gives us this incredible terrain of material to work with. And that can be a great thing, but it can also be an intimidating thing. And so the inquiry arc, I think, in lots of ways, helps us make some decisions about how to approach teaching units and lessons. So a bit about each one of the dimensions. First of all, this developing questions and planning inquiries is really designed to front load the notion that social studies is about inquiry. It's about the questions that teachers and students create, bring to class, and then spend time thinking through. But you can't just spend all of your day asking questions. And so you need to start thinking about what are some of the ideas that we already know about the topics that those questions are based on. So the second dimension is really about this notion of identifying and applying the disciplinary concepts and tools. Now, in some cases, the questions that students and teachers have will be focused on a single discipline. A question like, what are you going to use your money for? Lunch or a video game? Sounds like an economics question. Whereas other kinds of questions, and I would argue that, frankly, most questions probably are more interdisciplinary in nature. So a question like, should we continue building transcontinental oil pipelines, has an economic focus to it, but it also has a real important political, social, and geographical dimension to it as well. So these ideas of discipline, knowledge, and skills, and concepts and tools is really critical. But again, that's not where we end. We start with questions, we look at what we know, but then we take it to the third dimension, and that is evaluating sources and using evidence. Because in the end, we want kids to be able to do something with the ideas and the questions that they have. And we all know from the internet has certainly exposed the idea that there are all kinds of sources of information, but they are not always of equal value in use. So helping kids understand not only that there are multiple sources of information, but how to evaluate those sources and select from them the ones that are most useful is really a key skill. But then again, we have to take it one step further and apply that evidence. We have to use evidence to create explanations for social phenomenon, and we have to use evidence to create arguments that will persuade others, hopefully will persuade others, of the ideas that we hold in mind. The fourth dimension then of the inquiry arc really focuses on what you do once you've formed explanations and arguments. And that's the idea of communicating our conclusions and taking informed action. As teachers, we all know that there are lots of ways that kids can express their ideas and go back and forth with them. But we haven't always been very good about allowing kids the many different ways of expressing their ideas, and the idea that kids can express those ideas in lots of different venues. Kids can talk about their ideas in classrooms, but they can also talk about them in school, in communities, and a whole range of other kinds of opportunities that we oftentimes limit ourselves from exploring. I also want to say, kind of echo the point that Kathy was making, that this document in some ways really pushes the envelope in terms of where we draw the line about what makes an effective citizen. And for too often, we've been content with kids who can recite information that we've handed down to them. And what we really need to do is start thinking about the ways that kids can really express their ideas in more and varied kinds of venues, as I said. So this notion that taking informed action does not mean that kids have to go out and picket every idea that they don't like. It means something as simple as writing an essay and trying to persuade their partner with them that they've got a new way of thinking about an idea. That's informed action just as much as any other sort of idea. Well, that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of what the four dimensions are. What I'd like to talk about now is the idea of how these C3 standards, how the C3 framework is different from other kinds of standards documents. Basically, there are four things that I'd point to. First of all, the point that Kathy really articulated nicely, which is that inquiry is really at the center of this whole thing. For far too long, we've let a fact-based, knowledge-based curriculum dictate the idea that we're trying to stuff ideas into kids' heads. Mm-hmm. We know that information, ideas, facts, all of that kind of stuff is radically important, but not unless you have a question that you're trying to answer. The second reason that this is different is we're going for both disciplinary integrity and interdisciplinary connections. Again, too often in the past, we've either gone way overboard in terms of everything is interdisciplinary, everything is part of everything else, and so it makes it hard to sort through and make any sense of things. Or we've gone to the other extreme where it's all been history or economics or geography or psychology, whatever. The idea in the framework is that both of those ideas matter. It's a tricky balance sometimes to figure out how to put them together, but that's what we really need to be doing. The third idea is that informed action is clear and present. As I said before, we can no longer accept the idea that kids are simply going to know some things and express what they know on a standardized test. We have to be able to see that kids are ready to stand up and take their role in society as citizens. And finally, in lots of ways, the inquiry arc represents an instructional arc. This is an idea that really, in lots of ways, pushes well beyond where the common standards documents go. We've been apparently afraid to talk about instruction when we've talked about standards, and I think the team thinks that that time is over, and that the inquiry arc really can act as a framework for designing teaching units and teaching lessons. And the idea that you would use a framing question to begin your inquiry with your kids really is a step toward what we think is a huge instructional push. So that leads me to just chat just quickly about a couple of things that we think really matter in terms of why this framework calls for a different kind of teaching paradigm. Recall the Bruner quote. He said that any idea can be taught effectively to any child. The fact of the matter is we haven't always pushed ourselves on the can be part of that. What really matters in every classroom situation are three things: ideas, teachers, and learners. But even those three things by themselves are not enough, because it's the interactions between teachers and ideas, teachers and students, students and ideas, that really makes classrooms sing. And I think in some ways we sometimes forget that in our push toward test-based lessons and all of that sort of thing. But I think the real change in teaching that this framework calls for is that we have to change our perception of what kids are capable of. For far too long, I think we've thought of kids as empty vessels, as empty hard drives that we need to overwrite and fill up. And the fact of the matter is, kids, whether their ideas are naive, misguided, or whatever, they come to school with ideas about the way that the world works. And if we don't take the time to, A, appreciate that they bring those ideas, and B, hear what those ideas are, sometimes our teaching can miss the mark. So as much as this idea of the inquiry arc is about teaching and learning, it's really about trying to figure out how to work with kids in ways that really promote and authenticate their ideas. Well, one of the ways that we think that this can happen is through the use of compelling and supporting questions. Teachers always have used questions in classrooms, but for the longest time, most of the questions that teachers have used have been to check students' understanding. Rarely have we used questions as a way to frame inquiries. And I think that's, if there's anything that our audience takes away, it should be that the framework is promoting an inquiry way of teaching social studies, and that we think that it will pay off in big measure as kids get engaged with it. But one way of doing that is to think about two kinds of questions. Compelling questions focus on real social issues, real social problems, curiosities about the way that the world works. They're the questions that kind of get under your skin, and you have to deal with them because they're going to nag you otherwise. We think that there are two conditions that make a question compelling. One of them is that it has to be intellectually meaty, and the second is it needs to be kid-friendly. By intellectually meaty, what I mean is it has to be an idea that is rich, that people have been talking about for a while, that adults as well as children would find interesting and worth engaging with. And intellectually meaty also means that it has to represent multiple disciplines. It can't be a question that's so narrowly focused that it doesn't allow for some free exploration. So an example of a compelling question would be something like, was the American Revolution revolutionary? Well, we think that meets the qualification of intellectually meeting because, honestly, there are thousands of books that scholars have written about the American Revolution trying to figure out just that very question. Did it really revolutionize American society and America's place in the world? And did it do so politically but not economically, or economically but not socially? And so the idea that you need to explore multiple disciplines to answer that question is really key. The second reason that we think this is a compelling question is because we think it's kid-friendly. The idea is it's an authentic kind of question. It's a question that kids would find interesting. in some ways, they're going to find it interesting because it sounds like adults aren't really sure what the answer is. And frankly, anytime that kids can have some fun with the idea that adults might not know something, you've got them hooked for days and days and days of instruction. So thinking about a compelling question in terms both of its intellectual heft, but also its relevance to the things that kids care about, really are the things that we think define a compelling question. A supporting question, by contrast, helps us scaffold students' investigations into ideas and issues that lie behind a compelling question. So a question like, what are the 5 major sources of oil, or who are our community helpers, are perfectly legitimate social studies questions, but they lack the intellectual meat, and frankly, they're not all that compelling for kids in terms of ideas that they care about. They are, however, really useful questions in support of some larger compelling question. And so when we talked about earlier, I mentioned the idea that a compelling question could be, should we begin or should we continue using transcontinental oil lines? One of the scaffolding questions that we might in support of that is to ask the question, what are the sources of oil and where are they located? And so to that end, we think that supporting questions are a way to build the bigger framework of an inquiry and then move from there.
Yeah, great.
Well, all of this is really designed, frankly, to help kids see a way to think about and care about the social world around them and the many, many ways that teachers can help them do that. Teachers form a very important bridge between children and ideas and the larger social world, and we think that the C3 framework offers an opportunity to do that. Okay. Thanks, Michelle and Susan.
Thank you, SG. Susan, what do you think of that?
Well, I think that it's clear that we're asking teachers to do quite a bit more, and to do it in a different way, and to be more compelling in their instruction. So it's a heavy lift that we're asking for.
Yeah.
But the exciting thing is that this framework provides the support that teachers are going to need and maps it out for both teachers and students. Mm-hmm. So we're not leaving them out on their own with this heavy lift. We're mm-hmm. providing exactly the kind of support they need. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was so reassuring and affirming during the process, we had the 50 teachers who were part of our collaborative, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. and they looked at every iteration of the C3 framework, and they were excited, very excited. So they could see that it was going to be different and challenging, but they were excited, and they mm-hmm. still are. So I think we're going to find that both teachers and students are going to be much more excited about this way of doing social studies. Yes.
And we know there's a lot of good teachers already teaching right. in this way, but this will encourage and validate that way of teaching, so it's right. exciting. Very quickly, let me bring on another topic. Early on in this project, there were a number of social studies experts from the various state departments of ed who were involved in the work. They emphasized the need for the document to be aligned to the Common Core state standards that many of their states were in the process of adopting. We know there's about 45 mm-hmm. states that have adopted it now. Not to supplant or default to, but we know that social studies education provides a wonderful context for promoting reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language skills. So it seemed only natural for the writers to intentionally demonstrate how the C3 framework is useful as a bridge for social studies teachers to meet the Common Core. You're going to meet in just a moment Dr. John Lee, who's going to talk briefly with us. He is the Associate Professor of Social Studies Education at North Carolina State University, another leader of the work. And John's going to come on to explain briefly to us how the C3 framework connects to those Common Core state standards for English language arts. Thank you, John, for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. Glad to be here. The The publication of the Common Core was really a watershed moment for us in social studies, given that it came on the heels of 10 years of No Child Left Behind, which resulted in significant marginalization in social studies, particularly in the loss of instructional time for elementary grades. The Common Core was a new challenge for social studies. By incorporating social studies as a part of the shared literacy responsibility in grades K-5 and actually listing standards in grades K-6 for history social studies, as Kathy said, some people wondered out loud whether social studies was just being folded into English language arts. Well, a funny thing happened on the road to social studies' demise. Turns out the ELA Common Core got it right. The document sets forth a clear and rigorous set of standards for literacy in all the grades and in all the areas, content areas, particularly in social studies for us. And they function as a foundation for us to do the more ambitious work that we want to do in social studies, namely to prepare young people for civic life. So what does the Common Core expect of social studies, and how are we to build on that foundation in the C3 framework? First, and probably most importantly, the Common Core establishes a set of basic disciplinary skills that include the ability to cite textual evidence, the capacity to understand disciplinary vocabulary, the ability to distinguish among fact, opinion, and reasoned judgment, being able to distinguish competing or alternative claims, and the capacity to narrate historical events. In addition, the Common Core emphasizes research and anchor standard writing standard 7 and communication and speaking and listening standard 6. The Common Core goes so far as to even emphasize democratic discourse, something, of course, we're pretty good at in social studies. In speaking and listening standard 1B for grades 11, 12, it even says that students will work with their peers to promote civil democratic discussions and decision making. So what we did when we developed the C3 framework was use a 3-part strategy to make connections between the ELA Common Core and the C3 framework. We took care to make the connections to all 36 anchor standards in the Common Core and did that in 3 ways. First, the C3 framework has been constructed in such a way as to incorporate in its entirety the ELA Common Core. So as you examine and implement the C3 in the various districts and systems in California, you'll see traces of all 36 Common Core anchor standards. And you'll see that these standards are not only present, but they're emphasized in unique ways. But again, we see all 36 of these standards as being foundational to social studies. Second, we think that some of the anchor standards are particularly supportive of the inquiry aims of the C3 framework. Specifically, all of the reading anchor standards, actually, 1 through 10, writing standard 1 and standards 7 and 9, as well as speaking and listening standards 1 through 6 and language standards 6. The third thing that you're going to see in the C3 framework is that we have emphasized a small number of Common Core anchor standards that we see as absolutely vital to inquiry in social studies, specifically reading standard 1, which is about citing evidence, writing standard 7, which is about research, and speaking and listening standard 1, which is about participating in conversations with diverse partners. So the C3 framework connects to the ELA Common Core in addition by using shared language. We use terms such as argumentation, evidence, sources, discourse, and we're doing this to replicate and complement what the Common Core has done. You're also going to find numerous graphical and narrative explanations for how the connections work out across the disciplines. Given the nice foundation that the Common Core provides us for literacy learning, the C3 framework aims to expand on the notion of literacy by setting forth 2 kinds of literacies. First, inquiry literacies. We have these specific inquiry literacies that play out in dimensions 1, 3, and 4. Things such as questioning, as SG talked about, gathering information, using evidence, communicating conclusions, and taking informed action. But in addition, we focus on specific disciplinary literacies. These include, in history, using deliberative processes, in civics, using deliberative processes, participating in school settings and following rules. In economics, making economic decisions, using economic data and identifying prices in a market. In geography, constructing maps using geographic data and classifying historical sources. And in history, classifying historical sources, determining the purposes of an historical source, and analyzing cause and effect. We think that the most effective and meaningful way for social studies educators to implement the ELA Common Core is through the C3 framework. As we like to say, it's literacy through the social studies. So I hope this explanation of the connections between the ELA Common Core and the C3 framework has been useful, and I look forward to answering your questions.
That's great. Thank you, John, so much. You know, social studies teachers everywhere are being asked to help meet the Common Core, and this is a wonderful document to help give some great direction and support for that work. And this is the interesting thing, too. I've noticed that even if the C3 framework is not implemented at the state level, it's an extraordinary resource for all social studies teachers at the local level to help connect to Common Core, things they're being called upon to do, while at the same time strengthening their discipline. So I think it'll be a valuable tool at all different levels and stages. Susan, now that the document is out, there's a lot of energy and excitement about actually using it, getting their head around it. What can I do? How do I use it to make things more exciting and engaging for ourselves and, of course, for students too? So tell us a little bit about the next steps, what's going on to kind of help the on-the-ground teachers in the field understand this and use it, make it practical and put legs on it.
We have some big plans. And we're going to start with publishing a text of the C3 framework that will have some explanatory introductory articles by some of the same people that we've seen this afternoon.
Yeah.
So we're very excited about that. I think Michelle Herzog is editing that issue of Social Education. Yes. So we think that'll work out very nicely. We have a C3 strand at our annual conference. We're very excited about that because it's going to make it very clear what this looks like at the elementary level, what it looks like through the civics lens. What does this mean for assessment? You know, that's a big question in everybody's mind.
Yes.
So there's that whole strand is focused on those concerns that teachers have, and we'll try to start answering them. But also at the conference we have, everybody said that it has to be an acknowledgement of how important ELA fits into this. So there are a lot of ELA social studies sessions that make those connections very clear. So we're doing our best. We know that teachers have a lot on their plate, but we're going to help them. And we have a lot of hopes for the future. I mean, we have a big tent, and we're excited about that big tent, and we want to include everybody in providing some resources for teachers to make this a really exciting and vibrant movement.
Okay. Terrific. We're looking forward to it. It's very exciting. Very exciting. And so we'll be seeing all the things that come forward and calling on the field to help us make sense of it, make it alive, make it real. And how do you put that together and draw on the expertise we know that's in the field.
I want to add one more thing. You know, I talked about these collaborative relationships, and Kathy mentioned them. We're going to have a bulletin that Kathy will edit that will include contributions from some of these partners. So the museum, the Smithsonian, will be included in this bulletin and will make the connection between what these valuable partners see as their educational mission and the C3 framework.
Okay, great. Fantastic. All right, I understand we have some time for a few questions, and we've gotten a few that have come in. We have viewers here today live from LA, California, and across the nation. So here's a couple questions we have a few minutes to respond to. One question asks, what does this mean for California? We have a lot of California viewers tuning in and wanting to know that. And I can honestly say that even though there are no plans in place currently for California to update or revise our history social science standards, when California makes that decision, this document can be a very wonderful resource to kind of guide the discussion that we hope to see move forward. There was a lot of attention on being sure that the document was flexible enough so that it could be used by multiple states. When you start to look at it, you'll see there is content in there, lots of content, but there's a lot of wiggle room for states to kind of add or get to that molecular level of specific content issues so that it's more of a flexible, living document that can be used by many, many states. Some have already moved forward. Kentucky and Maryland have already used the document. They're in the process of updating their standards. Others are moving that forward. So it'll be fun to see the different things that develop out of that. Here's another question. I think we have time for this one. And I'm going to call on our experts out in the field. Someone wants to know, and of course we all want to know, down at the ground level, how will the C3 be different, look different at the classroom level? So if each of our guests, I'll start with Kathy, if she can give us a real quick 1 minute. How do you see this looking and feeling different down at the classroom level for either elementary or secondary? And then we'll move to SG and then John. So real practical.
Well, I think the strength of the document is that the teachers, that we see ourselves in the document. It's our greatest ambition for our class. But I can tell you that I'm struggling with it right now in my own practice. So I do certain things in the inquiry arc well, and certain things I've either not done or maybe have done without a lot of guidance. So, for instance, next week in my own class, we're working on developing compelling questions that's going to launch their own inquiry. And that's new territory for me. I like giving students questions. And so, learning how to give the inquiry over to students is going to be part of my shift as an instructor. And my guess is that teachers at the elementary and the secondary are going to have similar struggles. They're going to look at the inquiry arc, and they're going to identify with certain parts of it and know that they do those things well, and then other parts where they're going to have to grow. And we wouldn't have needed to write the document if everyone was doing it perfectly. So I think it's going to be an interesting time to watch teachers find their way through and plant their own inquiry arc flag in their classroom.
So inquiry, seeing you hope to see students involved in developing some of those inquiries themselves. We want them to become curious about the world, and this can frame that. SG, what do you think in a 1 minute response, if you can? How do you expect to see this different at the classroom level?
I think what's going to happen is that teachers are going to get phone calls from parents complaining that their kids want to talk about social studies all the time. And I think that will be a happy day.
Will for us, for sure. Great. And John, what do you think?
Well, I think a lot of teachers they feel burdened, particularly in terms of assessments, because the assessments don't get at the kind of things that social studies teachers want to do. And I think what the C3 framework does is it creates the space for teachers to teach the way they want to teach, to teach the social studies that they believe in, the type of social studies that engages young people, gives them the opportunity to take part in the process of creating their own knowledge, and then enables teachers to find out what students know about that process and about the inquiry. And so I really hope that this is an enabling thing that moves teachers into a place where they're happy because they're able to do what they want to do and what they know how to do and what they know is the right thing to do.
And I hope our viewers are picking up on this kind of continual thread, this instructional shifts, very similar to the shifts we're seeing with the Common Core for English Language Arts, Mathematics, and Science, inquiry-based, building curiosity, digging into text, looking for evidence, reaching some conclusions, and then formal presentations or informing action. So this, I think, falls very much in alignment to those same kind of paradigms moving forward. Another question I see here is, what is the message for district administrators or school administrators? How do we explain this to them and help them get behind this kind of effort? I don't know. Kathy, you want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I'd give them the C3 framework. I've got a copy right here. That's what I would do. I'd say read it, and I would say that one of the things that our states kind of said to us over and over again is they needed a document to explain to people outside social studies why social studies is important. And I think the thing that we did exceptionally well, if I must say so as a writer, is that we made a document worth reading. I've never read a standards document and not wanted to either drink or fall asleep. And I think that the C3 framework was written in an unbelievably compelling, makes a compelling argument for why social studies is important. So I often say it's 130 pages of awesome. So the way that I would deal with a district administrator is I would be educative about the framework and get them a Starbucks gift card and a copy of the C3 framework and say, have a great afternoon.
Okay, that's wonderful.
And Michelle, I know SG might have something to say as an administrator himself, but I think one really important message is that the C3 framework incorporates the Common Core.
Yes.
And as administrators who are working to implement the Common Core and to take on the responsibilities that come with it, understand that the C3 framework is positioned to help in that effort.
Yeah, I totally agree. Some of the trainings we're rolling out of LA County Office of Education here is to help articulate that more for teachers. And I think that'll be a wonderful service for school administrators and policymakers as well, decision makers in curriculum and instruction. SG, you brought up the topic of parents. How do we convince parents that this is a great way for their social studies teachers to teach their young ones, their children?
Well, I think it's really the idea that, first of all, kids are going to be interested in talking about these kinds of ideas instead of the myriad of other things that kids will want to talk about. And I think that when parents start to see the kinds of things that kids are able to do with ideas framed around questions, they're simply going to be amazed. And the idea that one is a good citizen, one is ready to graduate from high school and move into society just because they know some facts has never really convinced anybody that social studies teachers are doing a good job. But if parents and others can see kids who are making arguments, who are writing letters to the editor, who are able to articulate ideas in a meaningful kind of way, I think that's going to be hugely impressive.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Thank you all very much for your feedback to those questions. We have to wrap up, but before we leave, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our guests today who took time from their busy schedules, Dr. Kathy Swan, Dr. S.G. Grant, Dr. John Lee, for sharing their insights about this new college career in civic life. C3 framework for social studies state standards. I want to extend my own personal and professional gratitude to Susan Griffin, the Executive Director of the National Council for the Social Studies, for her leadership in the development phase and now in the very important implementation phase. We thought the development was a big lift. Implementation will take some real dedication. So I want to thank you again, Susan, for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be part of something so important. I have one thing to say: onward.
I also need to thank all my wonderful colleagues here at the Los Angeles County Office of Education for supporting this work, allowing LACO to be a part of this work and continuing it, particularly on our Division of Curriculum and Instructional Services with Raynette Sanchez and Yvonne Contreras and this wonderful tech team who've been really helping make put this webcast together for us. Just a few quotes to wrap up. The 21st century demands new and innovative approaches to acquiring and practicing competencies needed for success in higher education, the workforce, and civic life. The C3 framework for social studies state standards provides the K-12 guide for students developing these critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration, communication, creativity, and inquiry in social studies. From Dr. Stephen Payne, the president of the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. And one more quote we cannot leave home without from our own Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, co-chair of the Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools. Knowledge of our system of government and rights and responsibilities as citizens is not passed down through the gene pool. It must be taught. The College Career and Civic Life Framework will help each state improve civic learning for all students. Really profound and in big type on the back of the document. To learn more, I invite you to go directly to the National Council for the Social Studies website. You see it there, socialstudies.org/C3 for more information, updates, resources. That's the place to go. And also know that NCSS will, as Susan mentioned, will be featuring a strand at the upcoming national conference in November in St. Louis, Missouri as well. Also, you can check our LACO website for more information, professional development, and you can also view this webcast at a later date. You see the URL there at the bottom of your screen. So I want to just thank all of you for joining us today and joining our effort to revolutionize the teaching and learning of social studies for all students, to prepare them not just for college and career, but for citizenship and civic life in the 21st century. Thank you.